It's time now for Jim Johnson's program. We all know Jim, but let me tell you a little bit about him. Jim graduated from UNL in 1979 with a major in mathematics and a double minor in physics and philosophy. He attended graduate school for 1 year at the University of Chicago and then transferred to the University of Minnesota, where he received his doctorate in mathematics. While at Minnesota, Jim worked in a small computer lab owned by the University of Minnesota Mathematics Department. And from that experience, he decided that computer programming was more in line with where he wanted to go with his career rather than staying in academia and doing university level teaching and research. He still likes to play around with number theory and mathematical analysis from time to time, and he still thinks he may have one good mathematical theorem somewhere deep inside which will make itself known to him someday. While he waits for it to show up, he makes his living doing computer programming for the Nebraska Department of Revenue. Jim also enjoys volunteer work in various community organizations. He's currently the secretary of the Torch Foundation. He's an active member of the First Plymouth Church, where he ushers, teaches Sunday school, and helps with the popular Abend Music concert series. He serves on the Lincoln-Lancaster County Historic Preservation Commission, as well as on the Lincoln Cable Television Advisory Board. He's the board president for the Lincoln Municipal Band, and on a summer Sunday evening, you might see him handing out concert programs for the band's Antelope Park concert series. In addition to Torch Club meetings, Jim looks forward each month to attending the Lincoln League of Women Voters Lunch and Learn series, as well as his monthly book club meeting. People of a certain political persuasion may run into him at campaign fundraising events. So please join me in welcoming Jim Johnson, presenting his paper, which is entitled The Man Who Could See Through Time.
Thanks, Tim. So our paper this evening is about a particular author, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. But first, I wanted to tell you a couple things about myself that are relevant to why I chose this author for this to discuss in this paper. I grew up on a farm in the Nebraska Sandhills, south of Ainsworth, and I enjoyed taking walks out into our pasture, digging around for bones in what we on the farm called the blowout. Other people might have called it a ravine or a gully. It's one of those things. On other days, my dog Coco and I would take walks over to our clay pit and look for turtles or milkweed plants or dragonflies. I was into nature back in those days, and I still am, though I don't get outdoors as much as I'd like to anymore. And then the other thing about me that's relevant to tonight's paper is that even as a youngster, I love to read. And I particularly like to read nonfiction, but not just any nonfiction. My interests back in my youth were oriented toward reading about science and philosophy. I'd go down to our city library and pick out books by Isaac Asimov or Carl Sagan, or maybe Charles Darwin. And then later in high school, I think I probably read all of the Stephen Jay Gould books that I could find in our high school library. But I somehow missed out on noticing an author that probably would have meant more to me back than some of the others I just mentioned. And I'm sorry to say that I really didn't discover this person until recently, way too late to be a youthful inspiration. So this paper is my attempt to reach back into my past, relearn everything that I should have learned 50 or 60 years ago. And so come along and relearn with me. And for those of you who already know all there is to know about the subject of our paper, feel free to teach me a thing or two when it comes time for questions. So the subject of our paper is Loren Eiseley. He was born in 1907 in Lincoln, and then he died in 1977 in Pennsylvania. His biography on the Eiseley Society website indicates that his family always lived on the edge of town and that this setting opened the adjacent country to a wandering boy with an early interest in the natural world. In that sentence, I can almost see myself and Coco walking over to our clay pit to look for frogs and turtles. A book called Eiseley collected Essays on Evolution, Nature, and Cosmos, Volume 1, contains a fascinating chronology of Eiseley's life. He attended Lincoln High School for a semester, but then he dropped out. And then the next year, his uncle enrolled him in Teachers College High School, where he wound up as both captain of the football team and class president his senior year. He enrolled as an undergraduate at the University of Nebraska in the fall of 1925, but his time at the university included several semesters where he stopped out and then restarted at a later semester. And his stopping out included a couple of stints at hopping freight trains and riding the rails. And he also had a doctor-ordered trip out west for a time to recuperate from a respiratory illness in a drier climate. But he was back in Nebraska in the 1931 and 32 school year, and by then he seems to have settled into his university life. In the summer of 1931, he joined some classmates on an archaeological dig in Banner County. And then the next summer, 1932, he returned to that site and he came back with some bones of mastodon, rhinoceros, camel, and saber-toothed cat. And Eiseley's other interest, writing, was also still with him during that time period, as he was elected president of the Poetry Society in May of 1931. Eiseley finally graduated from the University of Nebraska in 1933 with a BA in anthropology and English. And he started graduate school in anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania in the fall of 1934. Due to the death of an uncle who'd been paying for part of his education, he wasn't able to attend Penn in the 1935 and school year, or 35 and 36 school year, but he did return in the fall of 1936 with the aid of a fellowship, and he earned his PhD from Pennsylvania in June of 1937. And he taught for a while at the University of Kansas, at Columbia University, and Oberlin College, and then he wound up back at the University of Pennsylvania in 1947, where he spent most of the rest of his academic career. Eiseley's friend Howard Nemiroff, commenting on a book that Eiseley wrote called The Man Who Saw Through Time about Francis Bacon, said that both the author, Eiseley, and the subject, Francis Bacon, were men who could see through time, and hence the title for this paper, The Man Who Could See Through Time. And parenthetically, I might add that for Eiseley seeing through time, his timing might have been a little off, because in a few minutes, I'm going to be reading a few selections from his writings. And one of the texts is going to say that by the end of this century, which would have been the 20th century, one of two things would happen, a good thing and a bad thing. We'll figure that out. But by my judgment anyway, neither of those things actually happened, although the bad thing might be sort of close to happening about a quarter of the way through the 21st century. I hope not. But anyway, so we'll come to that in a minute. But so now I do want to take a look at some of Eiseley's writings and then some of his themes and make some comments on them. A lot of thinking went into his books, and one can't reduce decades of scholarship into a 30-minute or 40-minute paper. I won't be able to summarize his writings in a few thousand words, but I do want to give some highlights that struck me as I was preparing this talk and researching Eiseley's life. One essay that first caught my attention is called The Judgment of the Birds. There's several stories in the essay, but the one that sticks out for me is an incident that he says he witnessed, where a large raven had raided a nest and carried away a little nestling. And the nestling's tiny parents were distraught. They were flying around the raven in circles, registering loud complaints, but the big raven wasn't paying any attention to them. Other birds joined those parents, crying out in what Eiseley calls some instinctive common misery, but they were all too small to challenge the raven. Eiseley continues this way. It was then that I saw the judgment. It was the judgment of life against death. I will never again see it so forcefully presented. I will never hear it again in notes so tragically prolonged. For in the midst of protest, they forgot the violence. There in that clearing, the crystal note of a song sparrow lifted hesitantly in the bush. And finally, after painful fluttering, another took the song, and then another, the song passing from one bird to another, doubtfully at first, as though some evil thing were being slowly forgotten, till suddenly they took heart and sang from many throats, joyously together as birds are known to sing. They sang because life is sweet and sunlight beautiful. They sang under the brooding shadow of the raven. In simple truth, they'd forgotten the raven, for they were the singers of life and not of death. I like that. Or consider this passage from The Hidden Teacher, following Isley's encounter with a spider on a web. The spider was a symbol of man in miniature. The wheel of the web brought the analogy home clearly. Man too lies at the heart of a web extending through the starry reaches of sidereal space, as well as backward into the dawn of prehistory. His great eye upon Mount Palomar looks into a distance of millions of light years. His radio ear hears the whisper of even more remote galaxies. He peers through the electron microscope upon the minute particles of his own being. It is a web no creature of earth has ever spun before. Like the orb spider, man lies at the heart of it, listening. Knowledge has given him the memory of Earth's history beyond the time of his emergence. Like the spider's claw, a part of him touches a world that he will never enter in the flesh. Even now, one can see him reaching forward into time with new machines, computing, analyzing, until elements of the shadowy future will also compose part of the invisible web he fingers. Is man at heart any different from the spider, I wonder? Man thoughts, as limited as spider thoughts, contemplating now the nearest star with the threat of bringing with him the fungus rot from Earth, wars, violence, the burden of a population he refuses to control, cherishing again his dream of the Adamic Eden he had pursued and lost in the green forests of America. Another of Isley's essays was called The Star Thrower. He tells the story of walking along a beach in the early morning, and he saw that the tide had littered the beach with all manner of sea animals, sponges and starfish, all dying because they couldn't get back in the water. And then he came across a stranger who was picking up starfish one by one and tossing them as far out into the ocean as he could. Isley's character thought that this endeavor was insane because the number of starfish was way too high for the star thrower to make much difference. But upon reflection, Isley's character came out the next morning and joined the star thrower, insane though it may be. And I do have two asides related to the star thrower before I get back to this paper. Number one is, if you look on goodreads.com at Isley quotes, there's a beautiful quote which sounds like it would be from this story, but which is not actually in the story. And I'm not even sure that Isley actually said it. Goodreads could be wrong. But however, if he didn't say it, he should have. The quote says that, tells the story of the old man talking to the young star thrower, trying to convince him that his star throwing task won't make a difference. The star thrower tosses a star out in the ocean and says, "It made a difference for that one." So I thought that was good. And number two about the star throwers, if you're an opera buff, here's an advertisement. In October of this year, 2022, the Isley Society plans to produce 2 performances of an opera based on the star thrower. One will be in Omaha and the other in Scotts Bluff. They're also looking into the possibility of performances at other locations. Nebraska Wesleyan is mentioned as one possibility, but anyway, if you go to isley.org, you'll find a link where you can learn about the proposed concert. And if you like, you can even contribute a few bucks to that cause. All right, well, now back to my paper. As a scientist, Isley was an anthropologist, and he's particularly interested in the evolution of human beings. He believed in Darwinian natural selection, but he got into a little trouble with other Darwinists sometimes, because it was his opinion that the human brain was too complex to have been entirely a product of natural selection. Following the exposure of the Piltdown Man fossil as a hoax, Isley wrote The Real Secret of Piltdown, in which he came down on the side of Alfred Russel Wallace in Wallace's dispute with Darwin on the issue of the brain's origin. Isley wrote this: "Today, with the solution of the Piltdown enigma, we must settle the question of the time involved in human evolution in favor of Wallace, not Darwin. The rapid fading out of archaeological evidence of tools in lower Ice Age times, along with the discovery of man-apes of human aspect, but with ape-sized brains, yet possessing a diverse array of bodily characters, suggests that the evolution of the human brain was far more rapid than that conceived of in early Darwinian circles. There's every reason to believe that whatever the nature of the forces involved in the production of the human brain, a long, slow competition of human group with human group or race with race would not have resulted in such similar mental potentialities among all peoples everywhere. Some other factor has escaped our scientific attention." And then in a follow-up article written a few months later called The Maze, he admits that he was roundly castigated by a few people who took those previous remarks as an attack on Darwin and thus an assault on the theory of evolution itself. And in a follow-up to that article called The Dream Animal, Isley lists 4 things that would have had to happen near simultaneously in order for the human brain to start its rapid growth. Number 1, the brain would have had to triple in size. Number 2, this increase would have had to take place after birth, as the smaller prior sized brain was already about as large as it could be and still allow birth. Number 3, human childhood had to be lengthened to allow the growing brain to receive and store knowledge gained from others. And number 4, family bonds had to survive seasonal mating and become permanent in order to ready the children for their role as adults. And as a corollary to his belief that the human brain couldn't have evolved the way it is, that Darwin said it did, Isley expressed skepticism that there'll ever be anything like humans anywhere else in the universe. He allows there might be some type of blob with intelligence or wisdom, but he believed that the likelihood of human-type brains evolving on another planet was too improbable to happen. All right, well, here's another. Later on, Isley started thinking about the future. I mean, a lot of his books that he'd written earlier were about the past. At some point, he started to think about the future. And here's a selection from a book, Scientific American magazine article called Man the Firemaker, in which Isley contrasted 2 possible futures for human civilization. He wrote this: "We hear a good deal about the Iron Age or the Age of Metals as a great jump forward in man's history. Actually, the metals themselves played a comparatively small part in the rise of the first great civilizations. While men learn to use bronze, which demands little more heat than is necessary to produce good ceramics, and later iron for tools and ornaments, the use of metal did not make a really massive change in civilization for well over 1,500 years. It was what Leslie White of the University of Michigan calls the fuel revolution that brought the metals into their own. Coal, oil, and gas, new sources of energy, combined with the invention of the steam and combustion engines, ushered in the new age. It was not metals as tools, but metals combined with heat in new furnaces and power machinery that took human society off its 1,000-year plateau and made possible another enormous upswing in human numbers, with all the social repercussions. Today, the flames grow hotter in the furnaces. Man has come far up the heat ladder. The creature that crept furred through the glitter of blue glacial nights lives today surrounded by the hiss of steam, the roar of engines, and the bubbling of vats. Like a long-armed crab, he manipulates the tongs in dangerous atomic furnaces. In asbestos suits, he plunges into the flaming debris of hideous accidents. With intricate heat measuring instruments, he investigates the secrets of the stars, and he's already searching for heat-resistant alloys that will enable him to hurl himself into space. How far will he go? 300 years of the scientific method have built the great sky-touching buildings and nourished the incalculable fertility of the human species. But man is also homo duplex, as they knew in the darker ages. He partakes of evil and of good, of God and of man. Both struggle in him perpetually. And he is himself a flame, a great, roaring, wasteful furnace, devouring irreplaceable substances of the earth. Before this century is out, either homo duplex will have learned that knowledge without greatness of spirit, will have learned that knowledge without greatness of spirit is not enough for man, or there will remain only his calcined cities and the little charcoal of his bones. And then in a similar vein, Isley wrote this in The World Eaters. The movement into the urban aggregations is intensified. The most technically advanced peoples will naturally consume the lion's share of the Earth's resources. Thus, the United States at present, representing some 6% of the world's population, consumes over 34% of its energy and 29% of its steel. Over 1 billion pounds of trash are spewed over the landscape in a single year. In these few elementary facts, which are capable of endless multiplication, one can see the shape of the future growing. The future of the planet, virus Homo sapiens, as he assumes in his technological phase what threatens to be his final role. Experts have been at pains to point out that the accessible crust of the earth is finite, while the demand for minerals steadily increases as more and more societies seek for themselves a higher, westernized standard of living. Unfortunately, many of those sought after minerals are not renewable, yet a viable industrial economy demands their steady output. A rising world population requiring an improved standard of living clashes with the oncoming realities of a planet of impoverished resources. We live in an epoch of localized affluence, asserts Thomas Lovering, an expert on mineral resources. A few shifts and subterfuges may, with increasing effort and expense, prolong this affluence, but no feat of scientific legerdemain can prevent the eventual exhaustion of the world's mineral resources at a time not very distant. It is thus apparent that to apply to Western industrial man the term world eater is to do so neither in derision nor in contempt. We are facing instead a simple reality to which, up until recently, the only reasonable response has been flight. The flight outward from what appears unsolvable and which threatens, in the end, to leave an impoverished human remnant clinging to an equally impoverished globe. And then there's this from the spore bearers. A term in military parlance, the objective, may be pertinent here. It is intended to secure the mind against the diffuse and sometimes inept opportunism of the politician, or the waves of uninformed emotion to which the general public is so frequently subjected. An objective is delimited with precision and care. Its intention is to set a clearly defined goal. Armies, or for that matter, sciences, do not advance on tides of words. Instead, they must be supplied logistically. Schedules must equate with a realistic appraisal of resources. There will never be enough men or material for a multitudinous advance on all fronts, even for a wealthy nation. Thus, as our technological feats grow more costly, the objectives of our society must be assessed with care. From conservation to hospitals, from defense to space, we're forced by circumstance to live more constantly in the future. Random tinkering, random response to the unexpected become extraordinarily costly in the industrial world which Western society has created. Yet paradoxically, the unexpected comes with increasing rapidity upon future-oriented societies such as ours. Psychological stresses appear. The current generation feels increasingly alienated from its predecessors. There's a quickening of vibrations running throughout the society. One might, in physiological terms, say that its metabolism has been feverishly accelerated. For this, a certain price instability has been exacted, the effects of which may not be apparent till long afterward. The attempt to conquer space has seized the public imagination. To many of this generation, the sight of rockets roaring upward has brought home the feats of science so spectacularly that we sometimes forget the medical researcher brooding in his laboratory or the archaeologist striving amidst broken shards and undeciphered hieroglyphs to understand what doom destroyed a city lying beneath the sands of centuries. The estimated cost of placing the unmanned Surveyor 3 upon the moon amounted to more than $80 million. Just one unmanned space probe, in other words, equaled or exceeded the entire endowment of many a good college or university. The manned flight of Apollo 12 cost $250 million. The total space program is inconceivably costly, yet the taxpayer up until recently accepted it with little question. By contrast, his elected officials frequently boggle over the trifling sums necessary to save a redwood forest or to clear a river of pollution. What then, we are forced to ask, is our objective? Is it scientific? Is it purely military? Or is it these and more? Is there some unconscious symbolism at work? At heart, does each one of us, when a rocket hurls into space, yearn once more for some lost green continent under other skies? Is humanity like some ripening giant puffball, feeling the mounting pressure of the spores within? Are we remote, though we may be from habitable planets, driven by that same irresistible migrating impulse that descends upon an overpopulated hive? Are we each unconsciously escaping from the mechanized routine and the urban troubles which increasingly surround us? Beneath our conscious rationalizations, does this play a role in our willingness to sustain the growing burden? Answers to these questions would be complex and they'd vary from individual to individual, but they're worth asking because they're part of the venture in understanding that is necessary to human survival. And then one final article that I want to talk about, and then we're almost done. In 1964, Isley brought together his love for both the scientific and the artistic in an article called The Illusion of the Two Cultures. He wrote this: "It is because these two types of creation, the artistic and the scientific, have sprung from the same being and have their points of contact even in division, that I have the temerity to assert that, in a sense, the two cultures are an illusion, that they're a product of unreasoning fear, professionalism and misunderstanding. Because of the emphasis upon science in our society, much has been said about the necessity of educating the layman and even the professional student of the humanities upon the ways and the achievements of science. I admit that a barrier exists, but I'm also concerned to express the view that there persists in the domain of science itself an occasional marked intolerance of those of its own membership who venture to pursue the way of letters. As I have remarked, this intolerance can the more successfully clothe in seeming objectivity because of the supposed open nature of the scientific society." And in 1977, Isley passed away. He was buried in West Laurel Hill Cemetery in Bala Cynwyd, Pennsylvania. Lauren and his wife Mabel are now permanently at rest under a gravestone that reads, "We loved the earth, but could not stay." So thanks for your time. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Jim.
Mhm.
Jim, I would ask you, the origin stories for both you and Lauren Isley required that you have not only the interest in the outdoors, but the time to really meander almost, even though you said you might be looking for turtles, in a sense you were meandering pointlessly.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if today, if we've lost not only a way of having that interest, but certainly lost that time where young people can just wander around. Uh, I mean, I have to say I have grandchildren who are 13 and 16, and I think wandering around the sandhills with their dog, they might be willing to do it, but it might also just sound just incredibly boring to them
Yeah.
that there's not
I,
more action going on. And I'm wondering what that means for us if we've lost that.
I do agree. I'm glad that I was a farm kid, but farms these days are, a lot of them are no longer family farms. I mean, there's huge farms that you, if you wandered around, you'd step in pig slop or something. So yeah, I mean, I do think that it's harder. It's much harder these days to be an Isley or me as a kid or whatever. So thank you for that comment.
Yeah.
Other
Other
questions?
questions?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Karen,
Karen.
you're
You're
muted.
muted, Karen.
There we go. I do have a question related to your final reading and comments, but if you will indulge me, I'm going to begin with a very quick personal anecdote. When
Mhm.
I was an English major at Duke in the late 1960s, I took a geology course. The professor had Isley's book, The Immense Journey, as one of the required readings because he wanted us, most of us were liberal arts majors, and he wanted us to understand science, not just specific facts or numbers of science, but to understand it. I ended up in graduate school in geology, as many of you know. But the reason Isley was talking about the two cultures, I think, was because at that same time, C.P. Snow had come out with his essay about the two cultures and the scientific revolution. And Jim, I would love to know your thoughts on the bridges, if they are there, between the pursuit of science and the pursuit of the humanities, because it certainly seems like in this era of COVID, there's a big cohort of people who refuse the scientific method or refuse any data or information coming out from our scientists. So what are your personal thoughts about how we bridge that gap between the science and the humanities?
I certainly agree there is. Now I have to say, when I read poetry, I'm not as much of a poet as Isley was or whatever. So going the other direction has been kind of hard for me too. But I mean, I think it works both ways. I think there are, it seems like, a lot of people who don't pay attention to the sciences. And then there are a lot of people that they're engineers or math people or whatever that sort of don't want to read literature, poetry, whatever. I mean, and you kind of need to be both. I mean, I wish I were more of a literature buff. I like to, when I am reading literature, I love it, but then convincing myself to go out to the library and pick books there instead of picking books out of the physics section or whatever is hard. But yeah, I mean, I think that we all need both directions. So other questions?
Hi, Jim.
Oh,
When I heard the title of your speech, I was like, oh, I think I've heard. Is there a recent biography of him, that's the title of the biography?
Well, there's I've found it inside a couple of biographies. There may be one called that, but I found the quote in the I checked out a bunch of Isley biographies, and a couple of them said that he was called the man who could see through time, partly because he wrote the article or the book about Francis Bacon called The Man Who Saw Through Time. But there probably is. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I had a wonderful teacher in middle school who gave me The Immense Journey, and I wasn't ready for it then. I mean, I think she knew that eventually I would like it, but yeah, she was a great English teacher. Just, you know, my question, I guess, is Isley died in 77, and
Yeah.
you know, a lot has happened, I guess, in the last 45 years. Do any of his writings address, I guess, near the end of his life, there would have been like the birth of the environmental movement, I guess, seeing what kind of arguments do you have to make about humans' connection to changing our climate? You know, was that on his radar? I imagine it was. But I was curious what you've seen or from what you've read of his.
Yeah, from what I've read preparing for this, I saw one or two references that called him sort of one of the early ecology writers, although they weren't really called that then. But yeah, I think he at least was in the beginning of the current ecology movement. And I'm not an expert on him. I'm an expert tonight because I've been reading for the last few weeks or so. But I do think that, I mean, some of the other articles he had were talking about that we're destroying the planet. We're you know, the trash all over the milk, whatever he said, the pounds of trash all over the world. So yeah, I mean, it was important to him, I think. So I think I saw Scott had a question.
Yeah, maybe not so much a question as a response to the point about CP Snow. And as a professional humanities person, I don't think it's the humanities persons who are COVID deniers. The humanities people I know are not. They're okay with science. I think the COVID deniers, they don't like the humanities either when you get right down to it. They just kind of prefer a certain, there's a vein of anti-intellectualism, I think, afoot, maybe that. But as a humanities person, as I say, go science. And yeah, and hooray for the epidemiologists and CDC and all those folks. Good work, scientists.
Yes,
Yeah.
I agree. Amen, amen.
That's right.
Jim,
Yeah.
I heard that a small house on South Street near 17th, very close to Walgreens, was Lauren Isley's childhood home. Is that accurate?
It could be. I wasn't able to find an address, but South Street would have been about as far out of downtown as you could get back in the early 20th century. So I bet you
that creek nearby
okay.
Evidently was where he spent a lot of time.
Okay, that's good to know. I did want to know where exactly he lived, but I didn't find it in the materials I was looking at. But
well, it is a noticeably small old house, but it's very close to Walgreens.
Okay.
On the south side of South Street.
17th and South or 18th. Yeah, Kevin.
Thank you, Jim. I really enjoyed it. I guess Isley was pretty early in terms of people noticing that we're using up our resources and trashing the earth. But when you were speaking, I was reminded of something that William Gibson wrote or said, a fiction writer. He says something like, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. So I think that was probably true in Isley's time. It's even more true now.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, I think you're right. Yes, iPad, Sandy.
Sorry.
No, that's right.
I changed my name. Really great paper. Very, very interesting. So I wondered, Isley and Bacon, I think, were probably born close to each other in time. Were they friends at all? And I know that Francis Bacon's work had especially progressed into dark work, especially during his Pope series. You probably looked at those. But they're very dark, and they were representational, I believe, of a turbulent relationship that he had during the time. And so I wondered what the relationship was between Isley and Bacon, and if in fact Bacon's perspective had anything to do in that representation that Isley was interested in.
Well, I think Bacon was quite a bit earlier. Does somebody know? I mean, yeah, I don't think they were really contemporaries. But now Isley does often quote in the materials I read, he often quotes Francis Bacon, but hang on a second, let me look.
Excuse me, Bacon was born in the 16th century, lived into the 17th century.
I was trying to get to Wikipedia, but yeah, so it was quite a, yeah. So it
But-
was,
There are
but-
two Francis Bacons.
Sandy's
Francis
thinking of, Sandy's
But,
thinking of the artist, Francis Bacon, not Bacon,
That's
the
what I-
scientist,
Yeah.
exactly.
and
So
philosopher.
thank you,
Okay.
Carol. Yes, and thank you, Scott. Yeah. So I was looking at Francis Bacon through the Pope series because we were talking about art, I thought, with Francis Bacon.
Oh,
So I assumed that it was the artist. So thank you for clarifying that.
okay.
No.
Mark says it was, the house is at 1811 South Street.
I see that. Okay.
Thank
We'll
you,
have to
Mark.
drive by
Google is
that.
our friend.
Mhm. Other questions?
Jim, I'm glad that you chose Isley.
Mhm.
I have admired his legacy, but never read any of his works. I had an opportunity to write a speech for First Lady Thone for Isley Day, and it was so superficial. I didn't get much of Isley, but she got enough to have a standing ovation. So, but I would really love to go there if anybody's up for a road trip.
Sounds good. Other questions? Bob.
Just related to Ruth Thone and Isley, she and a colleague of mine in various organizations, Maury Tuttle, were very interested, very involved in the, I think it's called the Isley Society now, that was generated around the time when she was First Lady and beyond. So they became very, very significant, and lots of other people as well. But those were two that I know of that spent a lot of time trying to, don't want to say resurrect, but trying to put him in the proper perspective that he deserves, which you have done a good job of tonight. Thank you.
And when you say Maury Tuttle, this is the Lauren Isley Reader is a book that was put out by the Isley Society, and it lists the Isley Society Board of Directors. And Maury's passed away kind of recently, but he was the treasurer of the Isley Society at the time this book was written anyway. So you win. Other questions?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jim. We really appreciate it. was
Welcome.
really fascinating. It seems to me that Isley really defied any kind of rigid disciplinary boundary, which we're so inclined to follow these days. It seems to me that it may be hard to ever replicate a person like Lauren Isley. But
Yep.
it was
You're right.
truly interesting presentation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for showing up. As I said, we will be back in touch with you in about 3 weeks, and let us hope that we will be having dinner together a month from tonight, and actually able to see one another in the flesh. So, hey, Sandy, could